Very few of us of a certain age can forget this picture. This shows President George W. Bush on the right, and the person speaking to his ear is Andy Card. And Andy Card is telling George W. Bush, who was at the time at an event in Florida speaking to school children, that a second plane has hit the World Trade Center. Now, the person on the left, Andy Card, is the President's Chief of Staff, and it's the position of the Chief of Staff which I want to discuss with you in this YouTube video. Now, the Chief of Staff, get my picture on, the Chief of Staff, the inspiration for this podcast is this book, by someone called Chris Whipple, called The Gatekeeper. If you are interested in this discussion, he is on a podcast, as all my information comes on these days, called American History Hit. I'm recording this in May 2023. It was on about 3 or 4 weeks ago, discussing the role of the Chief of Staff. And I'm using his book as a bit of an inspiration, I suppose, for this video, or possibly two, if run out of disk space. Now, the Chief of Staff won't be directly on your exam. It's not specified in the specification. However, he is a really major part of the EXOP, the Executive Office of the President, which of course is on your exam. And so he can be, part of an answer on the powers of the presidency and influence of the presidency, etc., etc. And I can almost guarantee that very few students in the exam will probably discuss the Chief of Staff, and even fewer, I would have thought, will be able to name any. So hopefully by listening to this by listening to this YouTube video, I'll possibly listen to the podcast as well. I'll give you an understanding of the Chief of Staff and how he, and there always have been he's so far, can help a presidency. Now, the basic argument of this book is basically that the Chief of Staff is significant in terms of the success of a president, and the choice of Chief of Staff often reflects the views of the president and his kind of character almost, and then a good Chief of Staff can help a president to navigate the job of being president, and a poor Chief of Staff can actually be a real problem for a presidency. That is the general thesis of this book. And if you did want to read the book, it kind of goes through American history since Richard Nixon, almost through the eyes of the Chief of Staff. So the first job then is, what is the Chief of Staff supposed to do? Now, one Chief of Staff who the author of this book seems to really kind of admire is someone called James Baker. He was Ronald Reagan's first Chief of Staff, and on his first day of office, or just before he took up the job, he was speaking to a previous Chief of Staff to find out what's in the job basically, and he wrote this list 1 to 4. I've added number 5 myself. So James Baker, the advice he kind of taken up was to resolve disputes that don't need to go to the president, so disputes within the EXOP, to be an honest broker and make sure everything's completely staffed out. So what that means is, you've got two competing views amongst the staff in the White House, or between a cabinet member and like policy advisors or something, and it's to be an honest broker between those, and try and work out what would be the best for the president, what would most meet his agenda, etc., etc., and not to always side with one or the other. A Chief of Staff, he said, is where policy and politics comes together. So it's not just about developing ideas on policy, which the cabinet might do, or advisors or researchers might do within the EXOP, but also to think about, well, how does this affect the politics? Is this going to help the president's agenda? Are there potential dangers, perhaps, in this policy? Will it go down well with members of Congress from our own party, or will it antagonise certain members of Congress? So to try and head off these sorts of issues. I suppose also added on to there from reading the book, it's almost like he's got to look beyond the horizon to see what potential problems there might be, potential scandals possibly, or difficulties, and again try and head them off, move them away from the president and the president's kind of area. And then obviously to administer the White House, to run the place, making sure everything runs smoothly. And you see the quote at the bottom, James Baker said, one thing I believe was to surround yourself with really good people. I would say that's true actually for most management type of jobs. You think of principals of schools, or you think of managers in, like, I don't know, McDonald's and stuff. They wish to be surrounded by really good people to help them do the job. And number 5 I've added, this is after reading the book really, I suppose it does fit into number 2 to some extent. It's being able and willing to say to the president, no, that's a bad idea. I advise that you don't do that. Which again, speaking truth to power, isn't it? And when we look at some of these chief of staff, some of them have not been very good at that, and it has led to disastrous consequences. Now, the chief of staff isn't in the Constitution, and as we know from we did this in lesson, the EXOP is also not in the Constitution. There was the Brownlow Commission under FDR, which basically said the president needs help, and you saw the creation of the EXOP. And this job of chief of staff is probably the most powerful, unelected position in the American government. He also is not Senate confirmable either. So it is a personal choice of the president. And many of them seem to last about 2 or 3 years, and then they get burnt out because it is a very, very high pressure job. Now, the first real chief of staff was probably under Richard Nixon, or the chief of staff who really kind of moulded the position of chief of staff. He actually went to prison for the Watergate affair, which probably not the best kind of role model. But anyway, Richard Nixon, he actually said this to his cabinet in 1971. Haldeman, that was his chief of staff, is Lord High Executioner. Don't you come whinging to me when he tells you to do something. He will do it because I asked him to, and you are to carry it out. I want discipline. It's up to Haldeman to police it. When he talks, it's me talking, and don't think it'll do you any good to come and talk to me because I'll be tougher than he is. That's the way it's going to be. That also, I think, reveals quite a lot about how Richard Nixon saw his cabinet, which is a probably entirely other discussion. But you can see the importance of this role to Richard Nixon. And the position of chief of staff and the roles which Haldeman kind of developed have kind of been the role model for this position ever since. Now, obviously, Richard Nixon falls from office in 1974, from memory, or was it 75? Anyway, around that period. And then you obviously had President Ford, who came in afterwards. And he had two chiefs of staff in his time. And the second one was a very young Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney later became vice president for George W. Bush and has a reputation for being quite tough. Some called him Darth Vader. However, when he was chief of staff, he gave his successor a wheel like this. I just got the internet, not this exact one. It's called Beware the Spokes in the Wheel. And what he means by this is that the president's in the centre, is the centre of all the spokes, and all these different spokes are people who want to speak to the president, have his time, influence him, give him their pet ideas, etc., etc. And Cheney's warning, I suppose, to his successor was avoid the spokes of the wheel. In other words, the chief of staff needs to be the gatekeeper. He needs to prevent the president having too many views being given to him, because basically it makes him unable to decide what to do. The chief of staff, I suppose, is the one who people should go to, and he can filter those views to the president and to help him make a decision. But presidents who kind of get information from all comers and anyone can kind of drop into the Oval Office very often end up being paralysed by the job and end up missing what the big picture is and getting, drawn out by minutiae. And so the chief of staff, in his view, is as a gatekeeper, which I suppose is why the book is called The Gatekeepers. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to do a second YouTube video where we will look at some chiefs of staff who have been seen as being quite good and quite effective, and we'll look at some chiefs of staff and also we'll look at why they've been effective, and then we'll have a look at some chiefs of staff who have been unsuccessful, which actually in many ways may be more illuminating. So I'll see you for the second video shortly.